Hello again, everyone. Edwin Lerner back once again. In this YouTube astrological segment, I'm going to be sharing my thoughts on the worst astrology chart, if there actually is one. Now, as far as what's interesting about people, I'll see. Have you ever noticed on the internet there'll be a number of people that will say, "Oh, I got the worst astrology chart, or one of the worst charts in ever," and this and that, and they'll be very pessimistic about their charts for whatever reason. They think there's so much negativity, and I mean, some of these people that will say that may actually have some planets and some dignity, or in some exaltation, or actually have good aspects in it. So, the thing about it is, the worst astrology chart, of course, is very subjective. Many people do think they have the worst astrology chart. So I don't think everybody can be right if you were actually choose one. But the criteria for this is subjective. But let's say, for argument's sake, let's say at least one of the worst charts were to have all planets in their fall. Of course, it would be in the worst position for each planet. Well, firstly, that is actually impossible. It's not theoretically possible for that to happen, because I could show it through this example. Now, a person, let's say they have their sun in Libra and moon in Scorpio, which would both be in their fall, correct? Now, let's go to Mercury. Well, if somebody were to have the sun in Libra, well, that would mean their Mercury would have to either be Virgo, Libra, or Scorpio. Virgo, of course, in its dignity, and then it's not, and then it's neutral, basically peregrine in Libra or Scorpio. So that really, I mean, that to me, I mean, shows right there. It'd be very difficult for anybody to make this claim that their chart is the worst. I mean, I'm going to talk about somebody a little bit later in the video that I think has perhaps one of the worst charts, and it actually may be manifested in very negative and nefarious behavior. Now, let's say, let's take, and then as I stated before, the criteria is very subjective for having the worst astrological chart. Now, let's say you take somebody that has all the planets in houses 1 through 6 at the bottom half of the chart, and let's say all the planets were all in feminine signs and with little or no positive aspects, say little or no sextiles or trines, and had a number of squares and oppositions, maybe even an inconjunct or two. I mean, really, this could be the thing about that is, though, that could be, I mean, seen as a negative chart to a lot of people. But remember that even subjective energy, I mean, when you have, let's say somebody does have all their planets in, not just a preponderance of planets, but all planets in the bottom half of the chart, and they were all feminine signs, and the ascendant in MC were also in feminine signs. Well, that could suggest introspective, introverted person, one that's more pessimistic than optimistic and more subjective than objective. But on one side, somebody that has a lot of subjective energy can still do certain fields, while one where there's more feeling involved, or I mean, subjective energy can often be incorporated or injected into astrological chart reading, or maybe even tarot card reading. So it's not like, I mean, it's very, I mean, speaking of subjective, it's just very subjective to see what is negative. I mean, planets in, even planets that are in their fall and detriment, you could still have some that, I mean, you could have some positive energy from. I mean, when you have a planet that's in, when it's in the positive, when it's in a detriment or fall, I mean, it's just really what it's stating is basically such as that the energy is not being expressed in the way they really wanted to in connection with the planet. My moon, as many of you may know, is in Gemini. Now, that is not considered detriment or fall or exaltation or dignity. But I think, I mean, the moon in its own way can be considered weak in Gemini, because it's not really what you consider something emotional, has emotional variety and versatility, but the emotions can be very non-sustained, very concise, really very quick, and not really ones that are not really enduring. And I mean, an argument could be made that actually the moon might be weakest in Gemini for that reason, because you have a planet that is really totally almost antithetical to the energy of the sign itself. The moon is about the emotions, and Gemini can often is a sign that might abstain from it and might even have such an aversion to emotional energy that they might even see it as almost like a weakness in someone. So really, I mean, that's basically what I'm saying. And really, the thing too is, now let's take, and remember too that somebody, even if you were to say that, okay, I have all these planets at the bottom half of my chart, they're all feminine signs. There's predominantly all adverse aspects. MC, ascendant are in feminine signs, but they could all move out by progression. Now, that's not going to eradicate the the actual effects of your natal chart, but it could still help a little, can alleviate it to some degree, and you could have some of those aspects move out through progression as well, and you could have some that might have been oppositions and squares. You might have some that might really, I mean, even if they don't move into another aspect during the lifetime, at least you could at least get maybe away from the adverse aspects. So anyway, well, and another thing too, let's say you take the so-called, one of the best charts one could have. Let's say you have something where, okay, somebody has, hypothetically, they got their 10 planets above the horizon. They're all in masculine signs. They are also, you have little or no adverse aspects. You have a number of trines and sextiles involved with these planets, and the thing is, the thing about that is that could suggest somebody that's a lot more objective than subjective, more optimistic in contrast to pessimistic, and also more extroverted and gregarious as opposed to introverted and private. But the thing about that is, even ultra exceptional gregarious energy can have its drawbacks to thinking, well, how can that possibly be? Well, the thing about that is, because a lot of times if you're doing, you're very extroverted and people person, the thing about it is sometimes you might unwittingly or inadvertently or even knowingly, you may neglect some other elements in that bottom half of the chart, such as the home and family life, where, I mean, you might be someone that has, say, career interests predominate and your status and recognition, and you're doing things for a lot of these, you could be more friendship oriented, which is okay and everything, but you might neglect some of your things really that are more connected with your family, and your home life is really what could be sacrificed. So it's not in really your own time as far as your own period by yourself. Now, some planets in the 12th could obviously help modify this to some degree, because even though the 12th house is on the top half of the horoscope of the natal chart, it's still the house, of course, connected with us privacy, solitude, and seclusion. I have a number of some astrological energy that is in my 12th house, and I have preponderance of planets below the horizon, so I know something about introverted energy and privacy and solitude and seclusion. So the thing about it is, so anyway, and the thing too is, now if we were to actually look at what would be another element of at least having one of the worst charts, let's say that somebody, I mean, they have all their they have all their planets, MC, ascendant, and mutable signs, where you say, well, what's wrong with mutable signs? Well, some people can have the perception that it could be a negative chart, given that those are the signs that are considered the weakest. There can be very malleable. I mean, adaptability is fine and everything, but mutable signs tend to have a little bit less willpower as opposed to cardinal and fixed on average. At least that's how I see it. And the thing about that too is that they are, they're really, the strength of character is generally not as strong, and they could be easily coerced and intimidated by others. So if somebody were to have that could be someone's argument. So I think, as far as having one of the worst charts, but remember that you can have that energy move out by progression as well, and that, remember that mutable signs, at least they have stronger pliability and adaptability, and to really go with the flow, which, of course, can be very significant when you have changing times. So it's not like they're really, like it's all bad. But the point I'm making is that there's such subjective criteria for actually having what would be considered the worst astrological chart. Now, the thing about it too is, now let's say if you based the worst astrological chart perhaps on having all, almost all, or either all or almost all of your aspects would be adverse. Now, let's take even one aspect as far as this goes. Let's say that you take a person that has their Venus well aspected and makes all these positive aspects. The person might very well be a very socially adept, socially adjusted person. But it doesn't mean that, somebody that has Venus making predominantly adverse aspects, it doesn't necessarily mean they're not going to be socially adept, but it could give a greater propensity toward not being, or maybe the person might have to work a little harder to doing that. I have Venus in my horoscope. I have Venus square my ascendant and Saturn. So it makes it a little bit harder for me to do things as far as connection with sociability, but it doesn't make it impossible. It's a little bit more of a laborious effort. And also, too, Venus well aspected in a chart, making, say, predominantly or all good aspects, could give a greater proclivity toward making money and not having as many roadblocks and obstructions. I've had some difficulty, and even somebody, say, with a Venus square, in conjunct, or opposition Saturn, if they have one of those aspects, they might even be in a state of destitute at some time. It definitely has a greater percentage, I think, of actually having monetary difficulties, but it doesn't mean you can't work through them. Negative aspects, adverse aspects in a natal chart can make you work a little harder for things, be cognizant of certain difficulties or what may seem as limitations, but it doesn't mean you can't overcome them. Somebody that has a lot of positive aspects might have a lot of this ability, so to speak, and affinity for things, and not having as much resistance, but at the same time they still have to make sure they're doing doing things in connection with that planetary energy or astrological energy or what have you, because if they don't capitalize on it and utilize the abilities, complacency and self-satisfaction, of course, could very well set in. So it's not like it's the end of the world if somebody has mainly negative aspects. Somebody had stated to me one time, they actually wrote me something. I think it was back in the day when I actually had my comments enabled, and they said something like, "Well, what's the point in living if one has a negative chart?" And and I go back to what I've stated before. The stars may impel, but do not compel, and impel is really more of a very difficult force maybe to resist. And then you have compel. It could be an irresistible force, one which is impossible to actually resist. So there is a distinction and difference between the two. Now, anyway, what I want to talk about as well, as far as some charts go, well, one of the worst charts that I have, ever seen was the chart of that cult leader, Charles Manson. If anybody may have personified evil, it may very well have been him. Some people don't believe that there's anybody is really nefarious or evil, but for those that don't believe that, he would have to be about one of the closest ones to it. He had a number of adverse aspects in his natal chart. He had, as far as aspects that would involve the planets, the ascendant midheaven, he had like 17. And when I'm talking about adverse aspects, I'm talking in my main perception is opposition, squares, and even inconjuncts. Now, if you count the North Node in Chiron, it was like 23 total he had. Also, he had a Grand Cross, which involved Pluto at 26 degrees Cancer, of course, a critical degree. He also, and it also involved Mercury as well. And his third house cusp was interesting. He had his third house cusp almost at 29 degrees Gemini, which of course it would be an anaretic degree. It'd be a critical degree. And also, the thing about it is, and even it's surprisingly in a way in Gemini, so maybe he was able, sadly, to use a lot of, this Gemini way with words to really bedazzle and beguile, to really help manipulate, really use that Scorpio energy he had used very negatively with maybe certain eloquence, surprisingly. He even had, I believe, Venus, he had that making a sextile, I think, to his Neptune, if I'm not mistaken. And it sounds like, well, it's auspicious, it's a positive aspect. But what people got to remember too, going back to what good aspects are about. Good aspects in many instances, yes, will produce some positive energy. Sometimes I think in some cases, like in Manson's case, the way that might have manifested with him is that it just enabled him to use that energy toward negative means. He was, by having Venus making a sextile to Neptune, I think it was easier to dupe people and manipulate people, those masses, into his cult. And Venus, of course, was at 18 degrees Scorpio. And 18 degrees, many see that as the degree of the devil. It can be very malefic. I do see that. Some people don't agree with how the degrees can work, but I've seen a number of these people with these 18 degrees, and very nefarious, a number of people that have had 18 degrees in their chart somewhere strong. So I think, for him, I think that could have very well played a role with him. And he also, not only he had all those negative aspects, he also had the moon, in bizarre eccentric Aquarius, and a lot of times the moon Aquarius can exude very good, humanitarian, selfless energy or what have you. But the moon made 5 adverse aspects, and also it was an accidental detriment in his 10th house. It was also the most elevated planet, which could have taken on more prominence and be more pronounced. Now, I really see his chart was one of the worst. I had actually, seen really, in one of the worst. If I was to I would put that near one of the top in terms, not just of the fact of the chart, but how it manifested with him in terms of his outer behavior and how he acted. That Venus in Scorpio, 18 degrees, was also his chart ruler, which of course made that more prominent and pronounced. Now, going back again to how, people can overcome adverse charts. You look at the renowned author Helen Keller, right? Now, the chart has a DD rating on Astro.com, so it may not be super reliable, but the planetary energy is still, I believe all those planets would still fall in the same signs anyway. Maybe not the exact degrees for all of them, especially the moon. But going with this chart, at least reluctantly, in her chart, she had no planets in air. The ascendant and midheaven were non-air signs. On the third house cusp, she had it near. She had it at either at 29 degrees Capricorn or very close to it. And that house, that's the critical degree, and you have the sign of limitation and restriction on it. And it was intercepted. Aquarius was intercepted in it. So I think maybe that figured prominently astrologically, maybe in her learning in a very unconventional and unorthodox manner. It would not surprise me if that chart was accurate because it gives Scorpio rising, which of course Scorpio rising can be very strong-willed, have a very strong willpower, indomitable spirit, very resilient. It's really like the metaphor for the phoenix rising from the ashes. The fact she had that great resiliency and worked through so much adversity. I would not be shocked or flabbergasted if she really did have a Scorpio ascendant. Now, the point being, I mean, she had all this negative things in her chart, but she managed to work through that, and she still overcame it and became, I believe, the first person that was deaf and blind to receive a degree in the Bachelor of Arts. So, I mean, it just shows you that, a lot of people can just give up, throw in the towel, figuratively speaking. But the point I'm making is you had, as far as communication and mentality goes, her chart can be seen as very negative. But what happens is sometimes when people have charts like that, as I stated before, it forces them to work harder. Sometimes there can be an overcompensation. In this case, it forced her to work laboriously, I think, to become someone that could still do things and be, as far as being communicative goes, in some way, shape, or form. So, and even, I mean, even maligned aspects, I mean, they do have some positive things. I mean, people talk about, the Saturn. I've seen, Saturn conjunct ascendant is, very adverse, very negative. I think if I remember correctly, there was one book I remember reading a long time ago, something about Saturn conjunct the ascendant, that the placement was a stinker or something. I have Saturn conjunct the ascendant. Now, I understand Saturn conjunct the ascendant could give somewhat serious disposition, somebody that might be somewhat disconsolate or sad because it takes on like Capricorn-like overtones or whatever, or undercurrents. It has similar kind of Capricornian-like energy. But with me, I mean, yes, I am kind of a, sad, stern, disposition. I mean, Taurus rising doesn't help. I mean, Taurus rising can be very stoic as well. And the thing about it is, I mean, I also have my deacon and Dwad is in Capricorn as well for my Taurus ascendant. So, of course, that factors in. But what I want to get at is that the thing about that is that has good elements as well. I mean, Saturn conjunct the ascendant people can be very, really be very consistent, constant, reliable. They could do things have a lot of discipline, do things on a regimented level where a lot of people maybe would have difficulty doing. And also another example, I think, is something that would be, sometimes very maligned is the moon in Scorpio, which of course in its fall, but I mean, it might have some negativity. I mean, the moon in Scorpio, what it is you got to remember that the moon, I mean, Scorpio is about death. The moon is about life, procreation. That's part of the reason why it's in its dignity in Cancer. But it's in Scorpio when it's considered its fall. I mean, the Scorpio is about death. But it doesn't mean it doesn't have any good characteristics or qualities to it. I mean, Scorpio moons could have very strong willpower, indomitable will. They could have a strong propensity to control the emotions, which could serve them well in a crisis or emergency situation. Many can do well in working as an EMT or someone that handles emergency-like situations because of the ability to control the emotions, although they can have convoluted, chaotic emotions at times as well, and very intense emotions. So anyway, but what I want to basically say in summation, that it's really looking at something and saying, well, this is the worst chart ever. I would just say, think again, people. So if you ever look at your chart and you say, well, you're very pessimistic and downcast, and you say, well, this got to be the worst chart. Remember, I mean, it's so subjective, and there's so many, and even people, I even saw somebody online that said they had the worst chart or something, or at least one of the worst charts, and I think they had at least one thing planted in its dignity or something, either dignity or exaltation. So I'm like, I mean, most charts will have some positive element or aspect to it, and you can always even derive positive things out of the negative. You look at Helen Keller's chart, classic example, I think, and remember about progressions as well. And the thing I want to close that I didn't talk about before is that you could also be helped by positive transits to points in your chart. I mean, somebody that has, strongly afflicted Mercury can have a good transit, say, from Uranus, making a sextile or trine by transit to their Mercury could give, more, maybe a little bit more ingenuity, innovation in thought, perhaps, and maybe be able to do something, mentally handle something Uranus-like, such as an esoteric subject like astrology, or even innovation, astronomy, aerospace, electronics, computers. So it could be auspicious for that, for example. And so those are, some things to look at. And I don't really believe there is no worst astrological chart. A lot of times it's just in people's minds. And a lot of times it's because it's just that maybe the superficial knowledge they have of astrology, which prohibits or prevents them from actually deriving the positive out of a lot of these adverse placements in their chart, or maybe just not seeing. Maybe they're over accentuating negative things in their chart, and they're not seeing maybe there might be some planets here and there might be in a dignity, or maybe in exaltation, or some good aspects that are there as well. So anyway, people, that'll conclude this YouTube astrological segment for sharing my thoughts on the worst astrology chart. And stay tuned next time, where I'm going to be giving you my Scorpio May 2018 horoscope forecast. Two things I want to get with you on before I head out. Firstly, the stars may impel but do not compel. And secondly, never isolate any single astrological element, aspect, planetary placement, position, configuration, influence, or what have you, and make an analysis of a person, astrologically speaking, based on this alone, because astrologically speaking, the person is the sum of all their components in their natal chart, and not just one. Until next time, people, stay well.